Hello, everyone, and welcome to Support Someone Saturday. I'm so excited to be here today with Katie Lowitzki, and she is Director of Donor Engagement at Exodus World Service. How are you, Katie?
Hi, Amy. I'm doing so well. And yeah, just so appreciative of the opportunity to be here with you today. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's awesome. I'm glad that we could connect for such a time as this. Thank you for coming on.
Of
I wanted to
course.
let you know a little bit about Katie. She has served in refugee ministry with Exodus for about 11 years. She loves her role as director of donor engagement, and she has a passion for connecting with others and helping them see the impact that they can have in the lives of refugees. Katie has a master's degree in education, student affairs, as well as a variety of work experiences in both higher education and nonprofit service. Outside of work, you can find Katie spending time with her family, her kids, and her dog, or enjoying coffee or a glass of wine with her friends. And she likes to hike in the mountains any chance she gets. Woman after my own heart.
Yes, anytime, right?
Yes, it's beautiful. I love being in the mountains too. So thanks for coming on Support Someone Saturday, Katie. And I have to mention how we got connected. So back in maybe 2015, I think we said we ran for Team World Vision together, another charity, and we raised money for clean drinking water in Africa. So many happy memories of that time. And a mutual friend of ours, Judy Chappett, had mentioned you, Katie, when she knew I was doing the series. So I'm thankful that Judy kind of, reconnected us, and it's good to see you here.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Judy, for that too. And
Yeah,
so the world feels so small on
I
these
know,
connections.
right? It's awesome. It's so cool. So I'm thankful for networkers out there.
Yeah.
So I am excited to hear more about Exodus. Katie, tell us, what is the mission of Exodus?
Sure. No, it's really where we should start, right? So Exodus has been around for actually quite a while. We were started in 1988, so a long time back, with the mission of really just simply mobilizing the Christian community to welcome and befriend refugees. So I think that's kind of the simplistic way to look at it, but that's been at the core of who we are as an organization from day one. And then, the services and the ways that we go about doing that have shifted some throughout the years, but the core of that has really been solid, and just it has really been consistent and the same. And we do that really through mostly through, I would say, working to mobilize churches. And I would say within that, the individuals in the churches. So sometimes that's the church itself in a larger community, or a small group, or a large group in a church. And other times that's someone in the church who catches the vision and who says, I really actually care about this population. How can I get my friends or my small group or even just my family engaged in this? And so we do that. I would say we start with the church. That's our mission and central to that, in terms of who we're engaging with refugees, when we're out recruiting and trying to make that happen. And within that too, I would say Christian community is very broad. So we're very ecumenical, definitely open to whether that's Catholic faith, Christian faith, non-denominational, just any way that you would interpret Christian, Protestant, Lutheran. There's so many facets of that we work with, and we're very just open, wanting to bring that entire kind of community in, as the focus of who we're really working to mobilize, to serve the refugee community.
That's awesome. And I'm just thinking, like, as you're mentioning this, is Exodus something that's here in Chicagoland, or is it across the nation? Like, where are you based?
That's a great question. So our base, we would say that we're Chicago based, at least currently. And I think we were established as a Chicago based nonprofit. And so the two places that most refugees arrive when they come to Illinois, at least, or the Chicago area, are Rogers Park, which is kind of far north in the city, or the DuPage community. So I would say those two communities, for whatever reason, have been the kind of hubs of refugee resettlement, in our area.
Mm-hmm.
And so within that, though, I would say too, we are starting to expand some. So interestingly, I think COVID and or just the virtual space in general, has allowed for us to start to make more connections with people, with churches, with schools, with other, yeah, just individuals, communities that are outside of Chicago who also have an interest in refugee work. And so I think slowly we're starting to make more indentations in those circles, throughout our country. And then the other thing I would say is that we actually, central to kind of who we are as well, we want to be a part of the refugee journey no matter where refugees are. And that's for Exodus meant Chicago area typically, but we know, gosh, that the kind of breadth of where refugees are in the world is so big. And so we realized, gosh, like internationally, and for a while, we weren't seeing as many refugees coming to the Chicago area, that kind of begging the question, how do we get involved kind of where refugees are? And so had started actually some work with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And so we were sending a couple teams, actually kind of partnering with a nonprofit overseas, and working with Syrians who are in a refugee camp there, and starting to do some things with a kids camp, and so kind of have our hands in that bucket as well. I would say it's hopefully going to keep growing and moving forward. COVID has made that like international space a little bit more difficult and tricky to be a part of over the last 9 months, but I do think that we will continue to work towards that end, in whatever capacity we're able and as we're able.
That's awesome. That's so good to hear, like just about how, where the refugees are here in Chicago and just how it's changed. And it's awesome to hear that you're able to go overseas and partner where the need really is, so that's really cool to hear. So for those of us who may not be familiar, what would you define a refugee as, or what makes someone a refugee? Can you explain that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think a starting place too. So a refugee, at least by definition, is someone who has had to flee their homes, their home country, due to some type of persecution, or war, or they're fleeing because simply they're not safe. They're not able to be where they are. And so I would say too, I mean, refugees don't, with that definition in mind, it's not people who are wanting to leave their home. There's truly some space in that where they're being forced out. It's not something that they feel like, for very legitimate reasons, it's not something in a home that they can go back to. If you were to talk with refugees too, I mean, their desire is to be home, and it's simply not practical. It's not safe, and so they can't do so. So that's by definition who refugees are.
Okay.
And yeah, there's actually the one kind of interesting note in that there's over 26 million, or right around 26 million refugees in the world right now, which is it's a huge number. I feel like very startling statistic when you realize that just how many people there are that are actually have a refugee status. And then the other space of that, there's a lot more people who are actually displaced, or who don't have a home also, but by definition, refugees have actually been given that status. So they've created kind of this process where they've shown that they don't have a space to go back to. And so that's who refugees are.
That's really hard. I'm just like, hearing you mention this. And I think even just at our church, we go to Willow Creek, mentioned, I think this past weekend, they shared a refugee story, about someone had to leave. It was a country in South America. It might have been like Venezuela or somewhere. And there was like a civil war, and it was very dangerous. And so, they had to leave, and just the sadness of that, and it was like, he had to leave like his grandparents and the farm, and he still wants to go back to this day. And he's been here for like 30 years and he plans to go back. So I can't imagine being forced out, but to live in a dangerous situation would be so scary. It's kind of like a life and death situation, right? Like you have to leave because otherwise you might not make it. But the sadness of leaving everything and having to start over, I can't imagine what that would feel like. It's one thing if you want to leave and you're prepared to leave, but another thing when you're totally not even wanting to leave, and maybe you're not prepared, or you don't even have the money you need to get set up again. Yeah, I'm sure.
You don't. And it is, you're right. Like it is often those super quick moments, or it is the middle of a civil war, or there's unrest, or your family has been persecuted so much that you literally are now at the space where you have to move to somewhere different. And then that somewhere different is like, okay, so do you go to the neighboring country? Likely. And then from there, you're in a refugee camp, and life there, I mean, you took, whatever bag that you had with you. And we often, some of our trainings and things that we'll take people through kind of walk through this process and this envisioning of what would you take if you were in a refugee shoes, and you had to leave your home in a matter of minutes. And how do you move forward in that, and what does that process actually look like? And it is, yeah, very heartbreaking. And I put myself in those shoes sometimes, and I'm like, it's, I don't know what we have as comfort here,
Yes.
or as what we feel like is our own security or our home, or what we're, like even the access to food and medical care and these things that we need in our minds need to survive. They're just not a readily available thing for so many people in this world.
Yeah. That's so interesting to paint the bigger picture. I'm kind of like, this makes me think of a question like, how are you as an organization like practically meeting their needs? Like, how do you come alongside the churches? Like, are you doing like helping them get like their first place to live? Or I'm kind of wondering how you go
Sure.
about helping them.
No. So Exodus, I think as a whole, so let me backtrack slightly a little bit too. So when I was telling you our mission is truly to mobilize the church to
Okay.
be involved in this space. And so when I talk about that, and it will kind of joke with people sometimes and go, okay, so the church is kind of our first client if you're
Okay.
looking at Exodus organizationally. And within that, we mean, okay, so the church is who we're mobilizing. If we're able to do something well, it's how do we educate, how do we empower, how do we mobilize and kind of gather this group of people to do something and make a difference for refugees. And so what that then means is, okay, so refugees are kind of this very close second in terms of who is our client and who are we serving. And
Sure.
so really they go hand in hand. I mean, you can't do the work that we're doing without both, and without people who want to serve and want to be a part of this mission. And yet there is just this huge need. And how do we respond to just the sheer numbers of refugees that do exist? And how do we like possibly have some kind of positive impact in that space? And so I would say it starts with education. And so when we're looking at what is Exodus do, we often kind of one of the program buckets that we would say, or the things that I would say we offer, is this opportunity to learn. And so we have a lot of different programs actually where you can get involved. I would say you can do one of our cross cultural trainings. And that is an opportunity to simply learn more about who refugees are, what they go through, what is their experience, but also just what are some of the cross cultural differences that exist. How do you enter into a relationship with people who come from a culture and who their world is very different than the US world that we live in here. And so kind of walking through some of that process with volunteers before they get engaged, knowing that we don't want to just throw people blindly into this space without an understanding. And so we start with understanding, start with education. And I would say too, we also have opportunities for simulations. We can get kids involved or youth groups or schools. We work with quite often also, but can do some simulations where even what you were mentioning of, gosh, what does it look like? Or you leave with nothing and you walk into that process, and we will kind of do a self or group guided process through what does that simulation look like? Can you put yourself in a refugee's shoes? And when it wasn't COVID, we would be able to do this in a building. We would have boats and props and things set up where we're actually, role playing you through this process where you're in the refugee, like you started in a camp, and then you're with your refugee family and you're trying to figure out how do you go through this process and possibly make it to another safe place. And so we'll do those types of simulations. I would say education is a huge piece. And then once you have the education, the service opportunity. And this is where we feel like, okay, so once people know and their heart really is there for the refugee community, what is it that we can offer? And we do have some quick onboarding kind of experiences where you don't necessarily have to go through all of that training to be part of the mission too. And so we do quite a bit of service right now we're doing kind of a care pack program where there's a lot of focus on grocery care packs. And that's something that has actually come directly as a result of COVID right now. We've seen a huge, I would say, just really like exponential growth in the number of refugees who need very just simply tangible help right now. And I feel like they've been very disproportionately affected in a lot of ways by COVID. And so they've, whether it's that they've been in the US for not long enough to have established a job, or maybe they established a minimum wage job, but then lost it, right? Like just didn't have a longevity where they could keep it. What we were finding is so many refugee families needing that tangible help. And so that's been a large piece of what we're doing currently is that practical space. But I would say one of the trademarks of Exodus too is that it's really something that we try to do through relationships with refugees and with these families. And so even if we're putting together a grocery care pack, wanting to go and deliver that to a doorstep, right? But then hopefully doing that with a volunteer who's now face to face with masks, with however that works in the time being, actually making a connection with that family. And that's also now kind of expanded this space where these volunteers now are able to connect and are understanding, so okay, what is the needs beyond just food or beyond this very practical, tangible help? What is your family or you really need? And so those conversations are happening. And one of the other kind of big programs that we're doing right now as well is called New Neighbor for Youth. And we are working with students and really students in the refugee communities who I think we're all experiencing challenges of remote learning right now. And so, looking at the refugee community though, in that context, and these students who kind of got thrown into that, where it's even, I look at my own kids and I'm like, okay, it's a challenge enough for my own kids who have parents who are educated and who understand technology at least somewhat, but who we have these challenges now to do school well. And I feel like that space has been kind of just an added increase of challenge for the refugee community. And so this program where we're doing New Neighbor for Youth is connecting volunteers who will have gone through that training then, but connecting them with a refugee student, and then in turn collaborating with that refugees, with their parents and with the school, and kind of being a one-on-one tutor at least every week. And a lot of that's happening like what we're doing right now over Zoom, mostly happening in that type of a setting, but it's providing that support for these students who really need it in this time, and as well then helping parents and these refugee parents who don't maybe have that understanding. There's someone now to ask questions, and there's someone to help kind of guide that process for them and help them engage in a little bit more effective ways. And that's been a great opportunity right now too. So.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for explaining, Katie, everything that you do. That really helps to get a greater understanding, of how you're reaching out hands-on. And it seems like you got some really cool programs going on and stuff that's really practical right now, which is amazing. So I'm thinking, say people are watching right now and they could be an individual, maybe it's a family or even someone, it could be a pastor or someone that's, in leadership at their church. And they're like, hey, we want to get on board with what you're doing at Exodus. How can we partner with you? How could they reach out? What's the best way to get in touch with you? And with
Sure. So you can definitely, I two ways, I think. You can reach out to me directly, which maybe we can throw out my email at some point,
sure.
Or however that works. I'm not sure. Yeah. But you can also just go to the Exodus website, which is exodusworldservice.org. And from there, you can get in contact with our program staff or with myself. I'm always happy to field questions or to get people connected to the right place in the organization to get connected. We would love to see individuals, churches, anyone that's wanting to volunteer right now, which is the need really is big. And so being able to be a part of that in this time, we feel like is something we're looking for. And the other thing I would say too is financially, we know, and I know, at least in my role, I work with a lot of our donors, and I know sometimes there's this kind of on-ramp of ways to be involved in an organization. And as much as I know people often want to volunteer and that's where their heart is, and we want to honor that, we know sometimes, the best fit for people to get engaged sometimes is to be a donor. And so I would say that as well is a great opportunity. And we definitely, any financial support very much goes back to the direct support of these refugees as well.
That's awesome. That was going to be my next question. Like, with the pandemic, how have things affected Exodus, and has it affected like your donations, and can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I do feel like even the programs that I was telling you about, those are more a direct result right now of the pandemic. And so even that, that space has definitely been affected. And I would say that too, they model some of our more traditional programs. and things that we would do when we're in a more normal space. Those things will still continue to happen, but we have kind of had to flow with what's happened with COVID right now. So the programmatic impact is there. And then the financial impact, I feel like we're blessed in a lot of ways. We have a lot of people who really are behind this mission and who have stayed true to that and are doing what they can. But that said, too, I talk with people all the time, and I hear our donor stories. I know that people's lives have been impacted by this pandemic, and so it's very real. And I think we're seeing certain people able to step up and do more, and we're seeing other people needing to scale back some, and their finances go to other things, whether that's their family or their kids, or there's other tangible needs where it's happening, and kind of money has had to be reallocated. So there is need, but I feel like we're very blessed. I feel like God is honoring this work and saying, gosh, it needs to continue. And so, we're finding church support, we're finding individual support, we're finding grant support. But there is a need. And the other space too. So I know I've talked a lot about how the church is who we work with, and a lot of that is individuals and churches. But that said too, I know churches are in this very unique space with COVID right now too. And churches aren't gathering in large groups. And so I think with that in mind too, we know so many, if we're looking at it as church units in that regard, we know so many of our partners have been affected. And it's very different to do church from remote spaces than it is in a building and together. So I think churches are wrestling through, what does this look like right now for them, and how do they simply keep their people engaged, let alone really promote these other organizations and needs that are out there. And so I think there is this wrestling right now of how to do both, or what does it look like for churches to take care of what's going on internally first. So I feel like that's a bit of a challenge, but we are finding, and there continues to be. I mean, the church obviously isn't a building, and it's not a space that needs to be, one spot to be in. And I think things will kind of pick up big picture at some point again. But COVID has been a challenge across the board. So.
Yeah. I like what you said about how God is just taking care of you all some way. It's like, that's how God seems to work, that even when it seems impossible, he will do, the impossible and make it happen for you. And I love what you said too, that church isn't just a building, which is so cool. But we shared at the beginning, before we came on here on the recording, that this whole Support Someone Saturday was birthed because of the pandemic. So I wanted to get the word out about amazing organizations like yours that are doing awesome things even during this crazy time. And so it's awesome that we can have the online element and reach a lot of people, across the US, the world, that we might not have normally reached just in a church building. So I agree that, hey, the church is a body of people, of believers, and, in ways, this is a blessing in disguise. So I hope that, you guys just see things just continue to pick up and increase even as we go into 2021, and, you kind of find that new normal and the new rhythm. And, I look forward to seeing what happens, in the future. So yes, what is, like, I'm thinking, like, just talking about what you do, like, is there a success story you could share with us, like an individual or maybe a family of refugees that have been helped through Exodus?
Sure. So one story that's a little bit more recent that I actually would love to share is a refugee whose name is Prakash, and his family, his parents had fled Sri Lanka because of ethnic just kind of persecution in that regard, and they had fled to a refugee camp in India where Prakash was born. And he spent, I think it was 19 years in the camp there. And so really, which also I would say too is not atypical. That's very typical of refugees. I think one thing I didn't know before, the average time that people are refugees or in a camp is 17 years. So it's very typical that a child may be born and that's all they know is life in a refugee camp. That's not an atypical story. And so his parents had fled, and then they were in this camp. But at some point in India, but Prakash realized, I really, in his mind, it's like, I don't want to be a refugee my whole life. Like, I don't want to live in this space my whole life. And so he had actually left that camp, left his family, left what he knew, got on a boat, and took the boat, was hopeful that he could resettle in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
The boat was, damaged. There was a lot of rough space in that, not an easy journey, and actually never, Australia didn't let him in. So that space of going from one camp, trying to resettle into another country, didn't work out in that regard, and he ended up in an island off Australia. I think it's called the Nauru Island, where there's another refugee camp. So he was there. He had applied for resettlement status or refugee status, hadn't heard back, was just kind of in this waiting process. And was there. The authorities at that camp had told him, we think maybe 6 months. 6 months is kind of what you're looking at to be here, and then maybe we can figure out these next steps going forward. So 6 years later, he
Wow.
had given up a lot of hope, and I think life in that camp, you would compare it to what was in a prison. It's just kind of very rough circumstances, not atypical, like beatings would happen, just very rough in that refugee camp. But he also, had given up this space of hope of being resettled. And so so 6 years later, learned that, he actually was accepted into a resettlement program in the US, which also is something interesting to note. Refugees don't get to choose where they go. So once they have refugee status, they go through that process, and then a country is determined where they can actually resettle. And so he was granted refugee status and allowed to resettle in Chicago. And in that process, so Exodus had received a name. We knew he was coming, and it started to mobilize this church group to provide what we would call a welcome pack. And that's another program that we do, which is all kind of these basic household supplies that you need when you arrive. And so this church had put everything together, was there, could greet him, and had this ready for him when he arrived. And so then got connected. He then connected with our New Neighbor program, with a volunteer whose name was Arul, I think. And the two of them connected. And what fascinates me in this, so Arul actually grew up in India, in the area where Prakash was a refugee, and so knew the language. And so they actually could start to interface and have this connection where they actually could communicate, which I look at and just go, gosh, like this is just such a God ordained moment of how do you connect a refugee who's gone through this massive journey to a volunteer here who they've grown up or have these commonalities. And so connected, and they've been getting to know one another. And I think within even the first, very quickly in Prakash's time here, one of the things I love about his story is that he said, how do I give back? And he's been part of our grocery care pack program and coming and helping put supplies together, and wanting to be part of this group that's providing help for other refugees in the community. So he's very much jumped in, been a part of that. He and his New Neighbor volunteer Rule have kept this connection going, and have started this friendship where I think both of them feel like this is something that can last a long time. And just it is hopeful for Prakash in a different space than he had. But it was, it's quite a journey to get from point A to point B to point C. And there's so much in between that. But that's one that's been encouraging recently to see.
That is so cool, Katie. That is an amazing story. I love how Prakash had the faith to continue to try, and then how God led him here, and then he meets a friend, his new friend, that grew up in the same place. That had to be so comforting for him to have someone that understood his culture, his language, maybe his customs, and now how they are paying back, or he's paying it forward by helping out. That's such a really like a full circle, amazing story. And kind of like when I was preparing for this interview, I thought of the verse in James 1:27. And it's pure and undefiled religion is this, or genuine religion is when you take care of orphans and widows in their time of need or time of distress. And I was thinking like a refugee is almost like an orphan in a way, because they've been forced to leave their country. And so they need help, they need support, and just how God just smiles on that, what you're doing and how he's orchestrating things, even with the friendship. And it's just so cool to hear the success stories and how God is working and using your organization. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And I have to be
life changing for a volunteer too. And I just, so encouraging, and it's something that people don't realize walking into it always, of thinking, oh, my life is going to change. And I think that's often the place that we find ourselves in, is not realizing how much we're going to change as a result of the service or the things that we involve ourselves in. But God, yeah, just how God orchestrates that space too. It truly is life changing for us being a part of it. And it's a very mutual space.
Yes, I agree. I think even just me joining Team World Vision, which I started back in 2014, and I was on in different capacities over the years, but it birthed in me just this heart for advocacy and helping people in need. And so I remember meeting Ann Wyrick, who was our captain, the first day, and she's like, it'll be exciting to see how God changes your life through this. And at first I thought it was kind of a scary statement, but I'm like, wow, like so much has happened that did really start back then. And it's just grown, and now such a desire I have to reach and help different people in different ways. So it's cool how your life changes for the better, and it's amazing to be on the journey, so
Yeah.
that's good. So tell us one more time, what is the best way for people to reach out and connect with either you or your organization? And if you want to share your email, you can do that, or the website, whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah, so my email, we can do it directly. So my email is Katie, which is Katie, then period Lowitzki, which is a mouthful, but that's LOWITZKI at exodusworldservice.org, or just jump on the website, which is exodusworldservice.org. You can find the staff links there as well. But again, I would be honored to talk with anyone who's interested, whether just learning more or wanting to kind of put feelers out for how to be involved, or if the time is right. I mean, it's anything that people would be interested in, I would be happy to talk about.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I'll put that email address up on the screen so everyone can see. And I so appreciate you joining us here today on Support Someone Saturday. It's been such a timely chat for this season, I think, especially with the pandemic and just with the need for different people. So thank you for sharing with us about Exodus World Service. And again, if anyone's out there watching or listening, you can reach out to Katie directly, or you can go to the website, exodusworldservice.org. So thanks again. Yeah.
Of course. Thank you, Amy, so much. It's been, such a great time to be with you. So thank you for having me.
You are welcome. And thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a wonderful and blessed Saturday. Take care.
All right.